My parents kicked me out after I donated a kidney to their golden child, and now they want me to take them in. Growing up, I always knew my place in the family. My half-brother was the favored one, the golden child. While I was just the extra backup, there to be used when needed but never really valued otherwise. No one said this aloud, of course, but actions speak louder than words. Anytime he needed something, it was like the world revolved around him. If he wanted help with homework, I was expected to drop whatever I was doing. If he wanted a snack, guess who made it? That's right, me. And it wasn't just the little things. My entire life seemed to be shaped around his wants and needs. Every decision at home felt like it was made with him in mind. It was like living in someone else's shadow, and I wasn't even allowed a moment in the spotlight. One memory that stands out is from when we were kids. I must have been around 10, working on a school project I was really excited about. It was for the science fair, and I'd spent weeks preparing, making sure every detail was perfect. Then, the night before the big event, my brother came down with a mild cold. Nothing serious, just a bit of a runny nose, but my dad reacted as though the world were collapsing. He canceled everything to stay with him. I begged to go to the fair, but they told me that family comes first, by which they meant my brother came first. That's just one example, but there were countless others. Every birthday party, holiday and trip I looked forward to was overshadowed by his needs. Once we had a family vacation planned, something I'd saved up for and dreamed about for months. But just a few days before, my brother decided he didn't feel like going, so the trip was canceled without any discussion or compromise. It was all about keeping him happy. It wasn't that he was a horrible person, he was simply used to being the center of everything, thanks to my dad and stepmom. They constantly praised him, saying how special he was and how much he needed extra care, while I was just there to fill in wherever necessary. Eventually, I stopped asking for things because I knew if it didn't benefit him, it wasn't going to happen. Now I understand that sometimes a kid might need extra attention. But this wasn't just occasional, it was every single day. I can't remember a time when I felt like I mattered as much as he did. I was like a backup plan, the extra, just in case something went wrong with the star. School was no different. I was a decent student, not exceptional, but I put in the effort. I had dreams of going to college and making something of myself, but my dad seemed to have other plans. Whenever my brother needed help with school, guess who was his tutor? And if I ever needed help, it was, figure it out yourself. One time I got a poor grade on a test and came home feeling terrible, hoping someone might care. Instead, my dad lectured me on working harder. But when my brother got a C on his report card, it was a full-on intervention tutor's extra study time, the works. It was infuriating. What made it even worse was the constant reminder that family sticks together. That phrase was drilled into me from a young age, but it really meant I had to stick with them. They didn't feel they owed me the same loyalty. It was all about what I could do for the family, specifically for my brother. And then there were the little things, the subtle remarks that built up over time. Like when my dad would celebrate my brother's smallest achievements but barely acknowledge mine. If my brother cleaned his room, it was a big deal, but if I aced a test, maybe I'd get a nod. Those tiny moments chipped away at me, reinforcing that I'd never be enough in their eyes. The worst part was how this treatment became so normal that I started to believe it myself. I thought maybe I wasn't worth as much, that I wasn't supposed to have my own dreams. Maybe my only purpose was to be there for my brother, making sure he had everything he needed. Looking back, I wish I had stood up for myself more, but when you're a kid and everyone around you says this is just the way things are, it's hard. I didn't have the confidence or the words to fight back, so I kept my feelings bottled up and pushed forward. It wasn't until I was older that I began to see how wrong it was. No child should grow up feeling like they're second place in their own family. But by the time I realized it, the damage was done. I'd already spent years ignoring my own needs for family. That was my life, always in the background, expected to give without asking for anything in return, and it shaped me, but not in a good way. I'll get into that later, but for now, just know that being the other kid in a family that only cared about my brother was rough and left me with scars I'm still dealing with. It all came to a head when my half-brother got seriously ill, not just a simple flu or something minor, but a severe illness. I remember the day the doctors told us he'd need a kidney transplant. My dad and stepmom were frantic, pacing and trying to figure out a solution. The doctors explained that dialysis could only be a short-term fix, and finding a donor was essential. And that's when everyone looked at me. Before I had a chance to process what was happening, they started talking about family testing. The doctors mentioned that it was common for siblings to be a match, and before I could react, my dad was already agreeing as if it were settled. "Michael, you'll get tested, right?" he said, like it wasn't even a question. What was I supposed to say? No. Of course not. I'd been conditioned my whole life to prioritize family. Family sticks together, right? So I agreed. What else could I do? The testing was long and invasive: blood tests, tissue matching, all sorts of things I didn't fully understand at the time. I was just going through the motions, not really thinking about what it all meant. Then, the day came when the results were in, and surprise, I was a perfect match. The relief was palpable. My dad hugged me, something that felt like a first in years. My stepmom cried, thanking me over and over. It was overwhelming. I was supposed to feel proud, right? Like I was doing this huge selfless act for my brother. But deep down, I was scared. The surgery was scheduled quickly. They didn't want to waste any time. The days leading up to it were a blur of hospital visits, paperwork, and awkward family dinners where no one really knew what to say. My brother was quiet, probably just as scared, but he never really talked to me about it. It was like we both understood what had to be done, so we went along with it. The day of the surgery arrived sooner than I expected. I remember lying on the hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that everything would be fine. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this would change everything, and it did, though not in the way I imagined. The surgery went smoothly. They took one of my kidneys and gave it to my brother. The doctors said everything looked promising, and we were both expected to recover well. I spent a few days in the hospital feeling like I'd been hit by a truck, but I was relieved it was over. I thought maybe now things would be different, maybe my family would respect or appreciate me more. But reality hit hard the moment I got home. My dad and stepmom were so wrapped up in my brother's recovery that I became invisible once more. They barely acknowledged what I'd done. It was all about him, how he was feeling, what he needed. I was left to recover on my own, physically and emotionally drained. Without so much as a thank you. About a week after the surgery, I tried to bring it up, telling my dad I was in pain and needed help. His response? "You'll be fine. Your brother needs us more right now." That sentence hit me like a slap in the face. I had literally given up a part of myself, and it still wasn't enough. My needs didn't matter, they never did. The worst part wasn't just the physical recovery, it was the emotional toll. I started feeling like I didn't matter at all, like my only role in the family was to be there when they needed something. Once I'd served my purpose, I was discarded. My brother eventually got better, attending follow-up appointments and moving on with his life, while I was left to pick up the pieces of mine. I tried talking to friends, but it's hard to explain the emptiness you feel when your own family treats you like a tool instead of a person. I kept thinking about all the sacrifices I'd made over the years, giving up my time, my dreams, and now even a piece of my body. And for what? To be cast aside the moment I was no longer useful. I wish I could say that was the moment I stood up for myself, but it wasn't. I just kept going, putting one foot in front of the other, trying to convince myself that maybe one day they'd see me as more than just a backup. But that day never came. Then one day my brother was having a rough day, and despite feeling awful myself, I started helping him. But instead of a little support or even a thank you, I got kicked out. My dad and stepmom decided they needed to focus on my brother's recovery, which apparently meant I had to go. I still remember that conversation. It wasn't even a real discussion. My dad just came up to me probably 2 weeks after I got out of the hospital and said, "You need to find somewhere else to stay." That was it, no explanation beyond, "Your brother needs peace and quiet." It wasn't like I was causing any trouble. I was still recovering, barely able to get out of bed most days without feeling like I'd collapse. So I packed up what little I had. I didn't have anywhere to go, no savings, no backup plan. I ended up crashing on a friend's couch. Shout out to Dave, by the way, he really saved me back then. But even staying there felt like I was overstaying my welcome after a while. Dave had his own life, and here I was, this half-broken guy trying to piece my life back together. Finding work was hard. I wasn't in any shape for physical labor, and most jobs I could get were demanding on the body. But I had to do something, so I started picking up shifts at a local diner. The pay wasn't great, and the hours were long, but it was something. At least I could chip in for rent and buy some food. The hardest part wasn't the physical strain, it was the mental toll. I felt completely abandoned. I kept replaying everything in my mind, trying to figure out where I'd gone wrong. Why wasn't I enough? Why did my dad and stepmom think it was okay to just toss me aside like that? Every now and then I'd hear about them through the grapevine, mutual friends, neighbors, random people who still kept in touch. My brother was doing well, of course, back at college, living his life as if nothing had happened. Meanwhile, I was working hard just to keep a roof over my head and food on the table. On top of everything, my health was a mess. The surgery left me with anemia, and some days, just getting out of bed was a struggle. I'd drag myself to work, push through my shifts, and then collapse back at Dave's place. There were times I wanted to give up, but I couldn't. I didn't have the option. No one was going to put my life back together for me. One night I was walking home from a late shift. It was freezing, and I didn't have a proper jacket. I remember thinking how ironic it was. Here I was, struggling to stay warm and fed, while my family was probably cozy at home, not giving me a second thought. That walk hit me hard. It made me realize just how alone I really was. I tried reaching out to my dad a few times, hoping he'd come around. I'd text him to let him know how I was doing, asking if we could talk. But I'd either be ignored or get some short, cold response like "hope you're doing well" or "busy with your brother." That was it, as if I didn't exist to them anymore. Dave tried to cheer me up, telling me I didn't need them, that I could make it on my own, and I appreciated his support. I really did. But it's hard to shake the feeling of being unwanted by your own family. It's like a constant weight on your chest, a reminder that you weren't good enough. One of the lowest points came a few months in. I was at work, trying to stay focused, when I got a call from a mutual friend. They mentioned that my dad and stepmom were throwing a party for my brother, celebrating his recovery and his return to college. I wasn't invited, of course. That hurt. Not that I expected an invite, but just hearing about it made everything sting all over again. I went home that night, sitting on the edge of my bed, just staring at the wall. I couldn't wrap my head around it. I had given a piece of myself for them, and they couldn't even spare a single thought for me. That's when I realized I needed to stop reaching out. It was clear they had made their decision, and I wasn't part of it. The next few months blurred by, filled with work and endless fatigue. I kept pushing forward, trying to build something for myself. It wasn't easy, and there were plenty of nights I barely made it through, but gradually I started to accept that I was truly on my own. Looking back, I think those months were some of the hardest in my life. It felt like I was constantly struggling just to keep my head above water, with the people who should have been there for me nowhere to be found. It was a brutal lesson, but one I needed to learn. Facing everything alone wasn't what I'd wanted, but it taught me a lot about resilience. I learned that I couldn't depend on anyone else, and if I wanted a better life, I'd have to make it happen myself. Though it was a painful process, it ultimately made me stronger. Years went by without a word from my dad. Honestly, after everything being kicked out, being left to fend for myself, I didn't expect to hear from him again. But then, out of the blue, my phone buzzed, and there it was, a message from my dad. "Hey, can we talk?" It's important. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake, like he'd texted the wrong person. Why would he want to talk now? But curiosity got the best of me, and I replied, "Sure, what's up?" He quickly responded, asking if we could meet in person. That surprised me. I hadn't seen him since the day he told me to pack up and leave. My gut was telling me not to go, but something in me needed to know what he wanted. We arranged to meet at a small cafe near my work. I arrived a bit early, nerves building as I wondered what to expect. Would he apologize? Try to guilt-trip me? My mind was racing with all the possibilities. When he walked in, I barely recognized him. He looked older, more worn out, like life had taken a toll on him. He sat down across from me, and for a moment there was this awkward silence as neither of us knew where to begin. Finally, he spoke. "I've been thinking a lot. About things about you that caught me off guard. I wasn't used to him talking about me, at least not in a way that suggested he cared. I know I haven't been there for you," he continued, "but things have been hard, and I need your help." And there it was, the real reason he'd asked to meet. I felt myself bracing, knowing not to let my guard down too easily. "What kind of help?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. He sighed, looking down at the table. "I'm in a bit of a bind. We're having trouble keeping up with the mortgage. My health isn't great, and I can't work the way I used to. Debts are piling up, and we need somewhere to stay." I sat there, taking it in. After everything they'd put me through, tossing me aside like I was nothing, now he was asking for my help. It felt surreal. "You want to move in with me?" I asked, trying to process it. He nodded. "Just for a while, until we can get back on our feet." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After years of struggling alone, he now wanted to come back into my life because he needed something from me. "Why now?" I finally asked. "Why come to me after all this time?" He hesitated, then admitted, "We tried asking your brother, but his fiancée wasn't on board. We didn't have anywhere else to turn." That hit me like a punch to the gut. So I was the last resort, not the first choice, not even the second, just the backup plan, as always. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of the situation. Part of me wanted to tell him exactly where he could go, but another part couldn't help but feel a bit sorry for him. He looked desperate, and despite everything, there was still a tiny sliver of hope in me that maybe, just maybe, this could be a chance to mend things. But then I remembered all those nights struggling alone, every time I'd reached out for some recognition or support and received nothing in return. I couldn't just overlook that. "I don't know, Dad," I said, keeping my voice steady. "You kicked me out when I needed you the most. Now you're asking me to take you in." "It's a lot to process," he nodded as if he understood. "I know I've made mistakes. I know I hurt you. But I'm trying to make things right. I'm asking for a chance." I wanted to believe him, truly, but trust isn't something that just appears, it has to be earned. And he had a long way to go. "I'll think about it," I finally said, needing time. He nodded, looking somewhat relieved. "That's all I'm asking for." We sat there for a few more minutes, talking about nothing in particular. It felt awkward, like two strangers trying to find common ground. When we finally parted ways, I was left feeling a mix of emotions, part anger, part sadness, and a lot of confusion. Over the next few days, I kept thinking about our conversation. I replayed it again and again, trying to decide what to do. On one hand, he was my dad, and a part of me still wanted to help. But on the other, I couldn't ignore all the pain he'd caused me. In the end, I knew I had a difficult decision to make, and whichever choice I made, it wasn't going to be easy. After our meeting, I thought I'd have some time to breathe and sort out my thoughts. But no, my dad didn't give me much space. A couple of days later, my phone started lighting up with his texts. At first they were simple, like, "Have you thought about what we talked about?" Or, "We really need your help." I ignored them, hoping he'd back off, but he didn't. The next day he called. I let it go to voicemail because honestly I wasn't ready for another conversation. But then I listened to the message. "Michael, it's your dad. I know you're busy, but this is important. Please call me back." I couldn't shake the feeling that if I didn't at least hear him out, he'd just keep pushing. So I called him back, and right away I knew this wasn't going to be a short chat. "Michael," he said, "I didn't want to bother you, but I've been thinking about our last conversation. I need to explain a few things." "Here we go," I thought. "Okay, I'm listening." He started in with the familiar family speech, the one about how family should stick together and help each other through tough times. It was the same line I'd heard my entire life, but now it felt different, like he was trying to use it against me. "Your mom would have wanted you to help," he said, slipping that in like a low blow. "She believed in family and taking care of each other. I know she'd be proud of you for stepping up. That one hit hard. My mom had passed away when I was younger, and bringing her into this felt like a cheap shot." He knew how much I loved my mom, and he was using that to make me feel guilty. I stayed silent, trying to process everything he was saying without letting it get to me. I know I wasn't perfect. He continued, "I made mistakes, but we're family, Michael, and family forgives. Family helps each other." I could feel the pressure building as he laid it on thick, and I knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't about fixing our relationship, it was about getting me to take them in and clean up their mess. "Dad, I understand what you're saying," I finally replied, "but you have to realize that this isn't easy for me. You can't just expect me to forget everything and pretend like it's all okay." He sighed, as though he was disappointed in my response. "I'm not asking you to forget," he said. "I'm asking you to let go of the past and focus on what matters now." Then he dropped another bombshell. "Your brother won't do it. He has his own life, his own problems. But you've always been the responsible one. You're the one we could count on." There it was, the ultimate guilt trip. My brother, the golden child, was off the hook because he had his own life. But I was supposed to pick up the pieces because I was responsible. It was the same story, just a different chapter. "Dad, I've been the responsible one my whole life," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "I've sacrificed so much. I gave up a part of myself for this family, and what did I get in return? I got kicked out." "I know," he said, his tone softening. "And I'm sorry for that, truly. But we're in a rough spot, Michael. I wouldn't be asking if it wasn't serious." I wanted to shout, to tell him how unfair it was to put this burden on me, but instead I took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. "I need time to think," I replied, hoping it would give me some breathing room. "Take your time," he said, though I could hear the urgency behind his words. "Just remember what your mom would have wanted." That line stayed with me long after the call ended. I couldn't believe he'd used my mom's memory to make me feel guilty. It was like he knew exactly where to hit to make me feel the worst. And the worst part? It was working. I felt torn between wanting to stand my ground and not wanting to let my mom down, even though she wasn't here to see it. Over the next few days, I replayed our conversation repeatedly in my mind, my chest tightening each time. The guilt was eating me up, making it hard to focus on anything else. I knew what he was doing, but it didn't make it any easier to ignore. I spoke to a few close friends, hoping for some perspective. They all said the same thing: you don't owe him anything after everything he put you through. He should be apologizing, not asking for favors. They were right, of course, but knowing it and feeling it were two different things. Every time I thought about saying no, that little voice in my head would remind me of what my dad had said about my mom. It felt like a tug of war between my head and my heart. In the end, I knew I had to make a decision, and whatever I chose, there'd be no going back. A few days after our last call, my dad reached out again. This time, he didn't just send a text or leave a voicemail, he showed up at my door. I wasn't expecting him, so when I opened the door and saw him standing there, I was caught off guard. He looked worse than before, tired, worn out, like he hadn't slept in days. "Michael, we need to talk," he said, his voice shaky. I hesitated for a moment, but eventually stepped aside to let him in. We sat down in the living room, the silence between us heavy. I could tell this wasn't going to be a casual chat. "I know I've been pushing you," he started, his hands fidgeting in his lap. "And I'm sorry for that, but things have gotten worse. We're running out of options." I stayed quiet, letting him speak. I wanted to hear what he had to say, even though I had a pretty good idea of where this was going. "We've tried everything," he continued. "We sold what we could, cut back on expenses, but it's not enough. We're going to lose the house." Hearing him say that hit me hard. Even though I'd distanced myself, it still hurt to think of him losing the place we'd called home for so many years. But I couldn't just ignore everything that had happened. It wasn't as simple as opening my door and letting them in. "I've thought a lot about what you said," he went on. "And you're right, we didn't treat you the way we should have. I didn't treat you the way I should have. That caught me off guard. I hadn't expected an apology, especially one that sounded sincere." "I let you down," he said, his voice cracking. "I was so focused on your brother that I forgot about you, and I've regretted it every day since. For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to believe him, to accept the apology and move on, but another part was still holding on to the pain and resentment." "I'm sorry," he repeated, his eyes filling with tears. "I know I can't change the past, but I'm asking for your help now because we have nowhere else to go." Then something happened that I never expected. My dad broke down completely, sobbing into his hands. I had never seen him like this before. He'd always been the strong, stoic type, the one who kept his emotions in check. Seeing him like this was jarring. I don't know what else to do," he said through his tears. "I've always tried to be strong, to hold everything together, but I can't do it anymore. I need help, Michael. I need your help." Watching this man I'd always seen as unbreakable falling apart in front of me stirred something inside me, a mix of sadness, anger, and a deep, aching sympathy. "I don't know what to say," I admitted, my own voice shaking. This is a lot." "I know," he said, wiping his face. "And I know I have no right to ask after everything, but I'm desperate." We sat there in silence for a while, the weight of the moment pressing down on both of us. I could feel the conflict tearing me up inside. On one hand, he was my dad, and seeing him like this was breaking my heart. But on the other hand, I couldn't just overlook all the times he'd let me down. "I need to think about this," I finally said, breaking the silence. "I can't give you an answer right now," he nodded, his eyes still red from crying. "I understand. Please don't take too long. We don't have much time." After he left, I sat there for what felt like hours, replaying everything in my head. Seeing my dad so vulnerable had shaken me. It was like all the walls I'd built around myself were starting to crumble. But no matter how much I wanted to help, I couldn't just forget the past. This wasn't just about finding a place for them to stay at. It was about years of hurt and neglect that couldn't just be brushed aside. I knew I was facing a decision that would change everything, whichever path I chose. The days following my dad's breakdown were some of the hardest I'd been through. Whenever I tried to focus on work or anything else, my mind kept drifting back to that moment, seeing him cry, hearing the desperation in his voice. It was playing on repeat in my head. I knew I couldn't avoid making a choice forever, but that didn't make it any easier. I kept thinking about all the times I'd been there for them, all the sacrifices I'd made, giving up my kidney, getting kicked out, struggling on my own while they poured their energy into my brother. Each memory felt like a punch to the gut. How could they possibly expect me to just forget all of that? One night, lying in bed, I couldn't stop hearing one thing my dad had said. "We have nowhere else to turn." Those words echoed in my mind. A part of me felt guilty, wondering if maybe I was being too harsh, but another part reminded me of all those lonely nights I'd spent fighting to survive, while they seemed completely indifferent. I decided I needed to talk to him face to face again. Avoiding him wasn't going to solve anything, and I needed to get everything off my chest. So I called him up and asked if he could meet me at the same cafe. He agreed, sounding relieved, like he thought this could be the turning point. When I arrived, he was already waiting. He looked exhausted. He probably hadn't slept much since we last spoke. I sat down, and for a moment neither of us said a word. The weight of what we were about to discuss hung heavy in the air. "Dad," I began, "I've been thinking a lot about everything." He nodded, waiting for me to continue. "I know you're in a tough spot, and I understand why you're asking for my help," I said, "but I need you to understand where I'm coming from." His eyes met mine, worry evident in them. "I'm listening," he said quietly. I took a deep breath. "You made a lot of choices that hurt me. When I needed you, you weren't there. You always chose them over me." "I know," he replied, his voice barely audible, "and I'm sorry for that." "I'm not saying this to hurt you," I continued, "but you need to understand why this is so difficult for me. I've spent years trying to move on, trying to build a life for myself despite everything that happened. Now, you're asking me to bring all of that back into my life." "I didn't know what else to do," he admitted. "I've been trying to make things right, but it's not easy." I get that, I replied. "But you have to understand that it's not easy for me either. I've been through hell and back, and it's taken everything I have to get to where I am now." We sat there in silence for a moment, each lost in our own thoughts. "I don't want to say no," I finally said, "but I have to be honest with you. I can't do this. I can't let you and her move in with me." He looked like he'd been hit with a sledgehammer. "Michael, please," he began, but I held up my hand to stop him. "I need to protect myself," I said firmly. "I've spent too much of my life putting everyone else first, sacrificing my own well-being for others. I can't keep doing that." "But we're family," he said, his voice breaking. "Isn't that supposed to mean something?" "It does," I replied. "But family isn't just about being related by blood. It's about how you treat each other, and for too long, I felt like I wasn't really part of this family." He lowered his head, struggling to take in what I was saying. "I never meant to make you feel that way," he whispered. "I know," I said, "but good intentions don't erase the impact. I've carried the weight of those choices for years, and I can't carry it anymore." He nodded slowly, wiping his eyes. "I don't know what we're going to do," he admitted, "but I understand where you're coming from. I hope you can figure something out," I replied. "But I can't be the solution this time." We sat there for a while longer, neither of us saying much. There wasn't anything else to add. The decision had been made, and now we both had to live with it. When we finally got up to leave, he gave me a long, heavy look. "Thank you for being honest," he said. "I wish things were different." "Me too," I replied, and with that, we went our separate ways. As I walked away from that conversation, I felt a whirlwind of emotions: relief, sadness, and a lingering guilt. But deep down, I knew I'd made the right choice. It wasn't easy, but sometimes, doing what's best for yourself means making the hardest decisions.